Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Representative and Madam Selectwoman, for being here today. I got to tell you, this day has been kind of rough for me. Just seeing the hostility in which people on all sides of this debate seem to treat each other. And I think that's unfortunate because I'm quite certain that we are all on the same side when it comes to the notion of wanting to prevent crime and prevent tragedies such that we heard about this morning. And I don't understand why, since we're just arguing over different ways to maybe make the world a safer place and fight crime, that people have to mock each other or think that they're being somehow, intentionally difficult when we're trying to get to the root of the issue before us. And I'll just say that I think there's a lot of assumptions by folks that are not familiar with firearms and the firearm laws in our state and our country that are getting in the way of some results. So I don't know how to word some of these things as a question, and that's my my obligation here. And it's difficult sometimes when you are trying to get certain things on the record to say to people so that they have something to respond to. I guess the first thing I would ask is, would either of you acknowledge that firearms have a place in our society?
Yes, I believe so, absolutely.
Yeah. So you would acknowledge that firearms are often used for good and not just evil?
Yes.
Right. If you have a
Absolutely.
problem and you call the police, you're calling them because they have a firearm as one of the reasons, and they can protect you potentially.
They can protect you, and if, God forbid, and it's at all necessary, they are licensed to use their firearms.
Right. And you would acknowledge that there are many, many very good people in our society that own firearms and use them lawfully?
Absolutely. Dear friends included.
Can you see why people who feel threatened when these laws come forward sometimes, that they feel like something that doesn't affect them, that they're not criminals at all, that they would be the first person to run into Sandy Hook Elementary School, for instance, to try and stop the criminal who was attacking folks? Do you see that sometimes they might feel threatened when they feel like the laws that are being proposed go just a little too far? And we can argue about what's too far and what's not, but
I suppose if someone thought that the law was going too far and directly targeting them, but I have to say, the laws we are talking about today, the bills we are talking about today, and I mentioned this when I spoke, my intent and the intent of these laws is to make sure that illegal guns are not in the hands of people who are not licensed and shouldn't be licensed, who are dangerous potentially, to own them. This is not about people who are legally allowed to own guns under the gun laws of our state, what is and isn't allowed, and they shouldn't be at all disturbing to responsible gun owners. So many of the gun owners that I know want these laws passed. They want to have safe storage, and we talked about this before. Who doesn't want to do whatever they can to make it more difficult for people, including children, who shouldn't be handling weapons, to be handling weapons that aren't theirs?
Right. I don't think you're going to get much of a disagreement from anyone about that. We all want the world to be safer, and we all want to keep guns out of the hands of criminals.
Sure.
The question is, how effective are the laws that we have passed and the legislation that is before us at keeping guns out of the hands of criminals? So the first thing I would ask is, are you aware of how many firearms there are in the state?
I don't have that number offhand.
Right. I don't think anybody has that number.
Yeah.
And part of the reason why we don't have that number is because very, very few of them are registered. Are you aware that there's almost no requirements to register firearms in Connecticut or anywhere else?
I don't think that makes me feel any better. It makes me think that these laws are, even more reason to have these laws.
Right. Again, and I promise to get to that, although I really don't want to take a lot of the committee's time. But so the only guns that are required to be registered in Connecticut are things that are have been determined to fit into a category called assault weapons. The rest of the firearms are not registered.
No, but the legal ones have serial numbers, and the people who legally own them are licensed to own them.
Right. Well, for many, many years, it was perfectly lawful to own a firearm in Connecticut, and I believe it still is, to own a firearm with or without a serial number, without having a permit, and it still is. The laws have changed recently to say that you have to have a permit to be able to purchase a firearm, or you need a long gun certificate.
Correct.
Do you believe there's something inherently more dangerous about a gun that does not have a serial number versus one that does?
The gun itself is not more dangerous than any other gun, but the danger of that gun being in the hands of someone who wants to do something bad with it, yeah, it's a little more dangerous. I think it's more dangerous. I think an untraceable weapon where you don't know where that person has gotten it, and it could have come from someone nefarious, absolutely.
Right. Well, we heard some folks in law enforcement earlier today, and I asked them about the crimes that they see. Yeah. And they made it very clear that they virtually never see a law-abiding person, a person who has a pistol permit, who's lawfully owns their firearm as the perpetrator of a crime.
Right.
It's almost always, every time, going to be a criminal or a gang member or somehow with a stolen firearm. So I guess just thinking about that, does it make any difference whether someone purchases a constructed illegal firearm versus someone stealing one from somebody who's looking for money for drugs?
Well, I'm not sure it makes a difference where they buy it, but if we are able to close up one of the opportunities for them to buy these guns, I think that makes a big difference.
Right. Well, and the thing is that we already have laws that prevent people from transferring firearms to people that are criminals and without the proper credentials.
And yet they're still coming into the state.
Oh, I'm not disagreeing with anything that you've said so far.
Yeah.
I just want to point out something that I don't think people really realize, which is that these, and I do want to discuss the points made by Representative O'Neill earlier also, that people that purchase gun kits, which we were talking earlier as if it was a different thing, but an 80% lower receiver, those are really the same thing. That is for someone who wants to take on the task of producing a firearm, not entirely from scratch, but more or less. And I would just argue that I think very, very few of these end up in the hands of criminals. Most of them are produced by people interested in the hobby for their own purposes and because they are actively involved in the competitive shooting sports and they want to craft their own item, or they even want to do something like put their family name on the gun in the process of producing it, that kind of thing. Sure. And it would already be illegal for them to transfer that gun to someone who's ineligible to purchase it. So we already have that protection. I guess the question comes down to, do we want to loop in that person with some criminals who might be in the process of producing a firearm without a serial number for the sake of committing a crime?
I understand where you're going with this. And no, obviously if someone lawfully wants to and is able to and has the background check and the permitting necessary to do this, no, of course not.
Right.
But any individual who is interested in circumventing our laws, any individual, right, whether they have a criminal background or not.
Right, and I think this is what Representative Dubitsky was getting at, is that I don't think you can determine the intent of someone, what they're going to do if they are sitting there looking at a block of aluminum. Well, and that's a very difficult thing to ascertain. And I agree with you that anyone that is attempting to circumvent our laws by selling a firearm, serialized or otherwise, to someone who is going to use it in a crime should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. We all agree on that. The question is, I think that you'd be surprised to find out how few crimes are committed with guns without serial numbers or that were handmade with care by some enthusiast, unless they were stolen to begin with. But okay, would you acknowledge, does it make any difference really whether that gun had a serial number or not when it was stolen from that person to be used in a crime?
I think if a gun is untraceable, it makes solving that crime and dealing with it more
Right,
difficult.
but you realize that a criminal stealing a firearm could easily remove the serial number if he chose to, therefore making it untraceable anyway. I guess the question is this: so you
Sorry.
you said yourself that it's a big process, and you recognize that to go through and purchase an 80% receiver and have the skills and necessary to machine it and produce a firearm out of it. Do you think that is more likely the way a criminal who is going to rob a store or commit a murder is likely to obtain a firearm, or purchasing one illegally off the street from some other criminal?
Could you, sorry, would you repeat that? I didn't.
I wish I had some statistics, and I'm quite certain that if you contact your chief of police and you ask him this question, how many guns used in crimes were a result of being stolen or and have serial numbers versus the number of guns that were created by someone as a craftsman to produce their firearm and then stolen?
Okay.
Yeah, so, and this goes back to the idea of purchasing for intent. So I think what Representative O'Neill was trying to get at is laws that are written, in order for them to be constitutional, they cannot be vague. They have to be very specific, because you can't prosecute people and send people to prison unless you have a really good idea of what the crime is that they committed. And a chunk of metal is a very difficult thing to determine when and it is or is not a gun. So I guess if I was really trying to get you to stand by this testimony, which you say should be the law, I would challenge you and I would say, so, Madam Selectwoman, when is a gun a gun?
I guess when you call it a lower receiver blank, if that's the same thing as a block of aluminum, I guess that's when it's a gun.
And I guess Representative Dubitsky kind of asked you a similar question, but what if I didn't call it that? What if I called it Fred?
I don't know. I don't.
Right. So that makes it vague. And I want you to understand that the reason why we're asking these questions up here is not to blow holes in your case or desire to
I
have more
appreciate that.
criminals with guns.
I appreciate that.
We already ascertained nobody wants criminals with guns. What we're trying to do is protect people that are decent, law-abiding people who would help stop crime and do, and also to make sure that the law is really clear so we don't loop in people that we shouldn't and we stick to the criminals. And that's a very hard thing to do, because once we start saying that this is an 80% lower receiver, which I think someone pointed out is only a marketing term, because it really might only be 78% of the object. And a lower receiver is just really a block of metal by itself, so you folks know. There's many, many poor parts to make it a gun. The thing about that is that the federal government wants to keep track of the ones that are produced, and we use serial numbers for really good reasons in crime, and you've already hit on that, which is good. I mentioned that guns are not registered, but we have a procedure in place whereby if a gun is involved in a crime, the serial number is recorded, and then they can go back to the to search gun stores to find out where it was found, and that's called a bound book. But that's not the same thing as keeping track of every gun produced by everyone.
No.
All I was getting at with the whole definition of a gun thing is that if we say that if this particular item is a gun because it is, in our opinion, 80% of the part of a gun, how do we identify what really is a firearm or not until it actually becomes a firearm? And further, does it matter if what we're really trying to get at is the transaction of that firearm?
I think maybe we're both saying the same thing then.
Right. So I guess the question is this. All right. So if I in one scenario, I'm a good guy. I like to target shoot. So I purchase a kit or an 80% lower. I build my gun and I go to the range and I shoot competitively with it. I never bother anyone. Scenario 2, I am a bad guy and I am trying to produce a gun without buying one on the street, which would be a lot easier in my opinion. But I'm going to go through this extreme expense and process of having to have all this machining knowledge and everything else to finish this gun, which is the stretch that's involved in this bill.
Right, but especially if it's a type of weapon that's prohibited in this state.
Okay, but I'm going to go through that entire process to make that happen. And then I'm either going to use it and commit a crime myself, which is already against the law, or I'm going to transfer it to someone else who's going to commit a crime with it. Both of things which are already against the law. How did we actually, passing this bill, do anything but potentially harm people that were never going to cause a problem?
I don't see it that way.
Okay. Who exactly are we getting at with this legislation?
People who are trying to circumvent our laws, a loophole of being able to own a gun without a permit, without the proper licensing.
Well, again, we've already established that you can own a gun without a permit.
Going forward.
Well, I mean, so we're going to require every person who owns a gun in the state to come forward to say they have a gun?
I didn't say that.
Okay, but that's...
I'm talking, you asked me what this bill does.
Right, I understand.
Yeah.
So you want anyone who would manufacture a firearm for their own purposes to have a permit?
Yes.
Would that be a more sensible bill to say that you cannot purchase a kit and produce a firearm, a ghost gun, for lack of a better term, unless you already have a pistol permit?
I believe this effectively does the same thing. It's keeping illegal guns out of the hands of people
No, this
who don't have
bill
the
says
permit.
that someone that has a pistol permit
Guys.
already. I'm sorry.
Oh.
But to answer your question,
Yeah.
this bill says that anyone, even someone who's never committed a crime, who is an Olympic shooter, for instance, cannot purchase a kit and build their own firearm. That's what this bill says. And that's the concern. That's why people are upset. They're saying, why are you going after us when you're simply trying to get at criminals? So why don't we say that, I'm just throwing this out here.
Yeah.
Maybe
I
the other
understand.
people on the committee might
Yeah.
say, you know what, that makes a lot more sense if we're really trying to make good, sensible public policy without causing a lot of problems. Oh, just one other concern that I just want to bring up too is Representative Dubitsky brought up a scenario where a law enforcement officer comes in and the two of them, him and his friend, are talking about exchanging this block of aluminum, and Doug's intent would be to turn it into a firearm, and to his friend, it's a paperweight. So if the officer comes in and witnesses this, under this law, if it became a law, the question I have is, what does the cop do? I mean, who does he prosecute, if anyone, and based on what?
I don't know.
Can he know the intent of either party, and is that even worth prosecuting them for?
What's that? No, I believe I've already answered that. I believe if you are able to trace the purchase of this, as you call it, a lower receiver blank, or piece of aluminum, back to a place or a market where you can have instruction and the intent to create a firearm, that's where the blame should lie with this.
Okay. All right. Well, I really thank you guys for coming forward. I think that this was a good conversation.
Yes,
I think
thank
we
you.
found a lot of middle
I
ground,
appreciate
and
that. Yeah.
I'm hoping that the members of the committee can work together to recognize that we're trying to get at a certain thing, which is to keep criminals from having
Absolutely.
guns traceable, serialized, or otherwise.
Right.
And
I
thank
agree.
you very much.
Thank you.
I appreciate being here, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Further questions from the committee?